Welcome to today's devotional. Today's reading was Exodus chapter 25 through 27, and in a lot of ways, this was kind of a different passage. It was very tedious in some ways. The author went into all kinds of detail about building a sanctuary or a tabernacle for God. He went into detail about the Ark of the Covenant, what it's to be made out of, what the dimensions are. He didn't cover the contents, which isn't most fully covered until the book of Hebrews. But the contents were to contain a jar of manna, the Ten Commandments, and Aaron's rod. In Exodus 25 through 27, the author went into detail about various pieces of furniture and some of the instruments that were to be used in worship and how the tabernacle was to be laid out. And again, it was kind of tedious in some ways because of all those details. He went into the details of measuring things and what their composition was or what they were to be made of. So there were a lot of specifics in these three chapters. But God said in chapter 25, verse 8, that it was a purpose statement. The purpose of these instructions was that He, God, might dwell in their midst or in the midst of the Israelites. Now, we know that God doesn't dwell in a tent or in a building. Having a place for God to dwell, quote unquote, was more for the Israelites than it was for God. I want you to think about your prayer closet or your chair that you have at home that hopefully you spend consistent time with God in on a regular basis. That specific place is not for God to somehow meet you there. Remember, God's omnipresent. He has an awareness of what goes on everywhere. The purpose of that specific place is really for you to have a special place to consistently meet with God. And the same thing was true with the Israelites. The purpose was for them to have a place set aside for them to meet with God. Another thing from this passage that I thought was very interesting was in chapter 25, verse 9. He used the word exactly. Make the tabernacle exactly as I have instructed you. He gave precise instructions on what he wanted the tabernacle to look like and what it was to be composed of. Why? Well, I think part of the reason was because God wanted no distractions, nothing to divert their attention from Him. There was a lot of symbolism in the things that were in the tabernacle that were a picture of Christ to come. Not that the Israelites understood this at that time, but there are a lot of things that were a picture of the new covenant. So I want you to think about this. In the Old Testament, God had a temple for His people. In the New Testament, God has a people for His temple. If God was concerned, as we read in today's passage in Exodus 25 through 27, about the Old Testament tabernacle, or later the temple, being just right according to His instructions, exactly was the word that was used in verse 9. What do you think He wants for His New Testament dwelling place? Well, He wants us to be holy. He wants His temple, which is us, to be holy. Think about how unacceptable it would have been for God for the Israelites not to follow His exact instructions in building the place where He would meet with them consistently. And think about how unacceptable it is for us today not to follow the instructions that God has given us to build our lives to be an acceptable dwelling place, quote unquote, for Him. Now let me leave you with one more thought. From your reading today, how many entrances were there into the tabernacle? How many ways were there to get to the altar of God? And of course, the answer is only one, if you remember from your reading. And how many entrances are there, or how many ways are there now to get to God? And of course, the answer is only one. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Not one of many ways, but I am the only way to get to God. So there's a lot of tedious information in these three chapters, but I think the application's pretty spot on for us today. That God wants to meet with us in a particular way, in the same way that He met with the Israelites, and He wants the Israelites' tabernacle to be done exactly the way He wanted it done, in the same way that He wants us to follow the instructions to live our lives exactly the way He has instructed us to live His life, to be a holy dwelling place for Him. So listen, we're glad that you're participating in this Bible reading program. I want to encourage you not to stress out if you miss a day or two. Don't focus on catching up. Don't look at this as a legalistic obligation. Just jump back in where you can. But specifically, if you read today's passage, my encouragement to you is to go be a holy temple for God today. Follow, with God's help and by His grace, as closely as you can, the exact instructions that He left for us, being a New Testament dwelling place for God. In the Old Testament, God had a temple for His people, and it was a beautiful, holy place. In the New Testament, God has a people for His temple. May our lives, the dwelling place of God, be beautiful and holy as we try to share the gospel to the rest of the world. Thanks for joining us today.